Did you launch? Okay. Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, that was a little disjointed, but I understand you're all movie stars now, so do it however you want. Have you, thank you. My name is Sean, by the way. Have you heard of the Library of Things? This is a new thing here at the library. You can check out stuff like eventually tools or I think airplanes and stuff like that, if you want. No, games, yeah. No, not an airplane, I'm kidding. But other stuff, stuff that you might want have use for a short time, but you don't actually want to spend the money on it. You can check them out just like books. So take a look upstairs. It's over by where the magazines are. Next week on the 10th, the Wheeling Poetry Series returns. Mark Harshman's thing with Jeff Worley, who's a former poet laureate of Kentucky, I believe. And he was scheduled here one other time and had to cancel, but he'll be here on the 10th. And on the 13th, which is Friday next week, so we have two programs. The Wheeling Symphony Orchestra is having a Masterworks concert featuring the Violins of Hope project. And that is Nazis. These are violins that were confiscated by the Nazis during the Holocaust from Jewish musicians and later discovered after the war in a variety of locations. And they now play these violins for you. But we'll have a panel here with the maestro, John Devlin, Rabbi Leaf, Roy Mazzari, who is the Symphony Orchestra's clarinetist. So that'll be on the 13th, and it starts at 12:30, a little different time than usual. Hope you can make it. And next Tuesday, not next Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that, on the 17th, a book called Collective Chaos, which is about roller derby. They'll be here, two women who wrote the book. It's a memoir, so see you then. Today we have back with us Ronald Lewis, who's a professor and Stuart and Joyce Robbins Chair Emeritus at WVU, Historian Laureate of West Virginia. He is the editor of 8 books and numerous articles and book chapters, and co-editor of 14 books. In retirement, he continues to reside in Morgantown, West Virginia with his wife, Susan, but he's here to tell us today about his new book. You see the title up there, Iron Artisans, Welsh Immigrants, and the American Age of Steel. Here is Ron Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you. You'll excuse me, I'm losing my sight, I think. Getting old, so I have to adjust these reading materials. So let me talk about this Iron Artisans, because people have asked about that. And one of the reasons I got interested in this was because there's a transformation that occurs in the late 19th century from iron, it's aged out, and steel takes its place. Well, there are a lot of people who were very skilled iron workers who then no longer had a place in steel. They could not all make the transition. And my interest in this, is partly set in that larger context. I'm not, I don't know, maybe you wouldn't, but in this town you might not be astounded by how much technical material there has been written about iron and steel. It is enormous. It would fill this room, literally, and more. So I don't want to come over trying to present myself as an expert on iron and steel, but I have to know enough about it to make it a context for the people that I study. And I come to this as a labor and social immigration kind of historian. So I'm interested in those people who come to certain kinds of work environments. And that was the case here. I did I've always worked in basic industries, I guess, and the immigrants who came to those industries to work in them. And I noticed along the way with the coal industry that there was never, or the iron industry, there's no, of all the literature out there, there are no books about the founding of those industries, how they were established. And that is a huge topic which I cannot even hope to address today. But in fact, I'll focus just on a couple of topics within my own. But that's what I set out to do, and is to work with the founding. And that's how I found the Welsh and, of course, the English. People at the time couldn't distinguish between the Welsh and the English. They knew there was a difference in this country, but they didn't care. It made no sense to them. And they're too busy to figure out all the nuances. So anyway, I did that. And so that's how I can get so specifically on the Welsh, because they were such a small group, and yet they're, I guess, of all the groups, they were probably more instrumental in establishing the coal industry, especially, and a very particular sectors of the iron and steel industry. So anyway, I'm just trying to distill something interesting out of all that, so I can squeeze it into a half hour or 40 minutes. So let me launch off into this. During the first century and a quarter, the United States received between 35 and 40 million, mostly British and European immigrants. The decades between the Civil War and World War I were by far the high water mark of this epic migration. Welsh immigration to the United States was chronologically, geographically, and occupationally concentrated. First came the pre-1840s agricultural migration of farmers in search of affordable land and religious freedom. Then came the much larger movement of Welsh industrial migrants during the decades between 1850 and 1910. These immigrants provided the core of the technical knowledge and skilled workers who established America's basic industries. The significance of the Welsh immigration that lies less in their numbers than in the fact they were masters and managers of the iron trades, who, in the words of one historian, directly transfused the skills and experience of the premier industrial nation of the 19th century into the veins of the rising giant of the 20th. In spite of their role as a nation in the nation's rise as a global power, steel and coal, the Welsh have attracted little scholarly attention. My initial plan was to write about the Welsh industrial migration generally, 80% of which was concentrated in the coal and iron industries. That quickly proved to be too complicated for a single volume. So first I wrote about the Welsh miners and the development of the coal industry. These industries are, of course, one wouldn't exist without the other in this period. Then, with this book, Iron Artisans, I sort of complete the larger plan, which was to do the general Welsh industrial migration. To do that, I adopted what's called a transnational approach, which studies movements, forces, and communities that cut across national boundaries. I concentrate on the transatlantic communications within the group because an immigrant group comes to the United States, that first generation has not changed. They're still who they were. It takes them generally a lifetime to change, to become somewhat adapted to their new country, and then subsequent generations who become assimilated. Anyway, that's the case. That's what I mean by communications. They communicate back and forth. typically people think, when they think of immigration, they think of immigrant groups coming to this country. They see the Statue of Liberty and thank God, fall down and say, never go back, which isn't true. Some groups have 40, 50% repatriation rates, some of the European groups. Among the Welsh, it's estimated it's like 30% of them may be repatriated. They just went, in fact, many of the British just came back and forth. When jobs were good here, they came here. When jobs were good back up, they went back up. So it's hard to really pinpoint this. And so that's why we call it transnational, because just because they came here doesn't mean they're different. They still have people back home that they write to and communicate with. And so it's those communications that tell you is how you get the texture for what life was like for them in America, for this first, especially the first generation. Well, I concentrate on this transatlantic communication within the group, as well as a transfer, though, of their work culture, which is, you have specific, if people don't have a common way of forging iron, somebody's going to get hurt. And so you have to know how to do that. You can't be stopping and telling someone every time. And so if you're either part of that or you're not, or you're learning. And if you're learning, you're on the periphery out here, so you don't kill anybody, right? So this is the work culture that they transplant here, are how to work with this material and how to produce what they intend to do, because it's, you're manipulating very large, heavy machinery and materials. So there are skills, and there are also technologies associated with it, and they transplant those to America in the 19th century. The transatlantic nature of the Welsh community of ironworkers is well documented in the Welsh Newspapers Project at the National Library of Wales. This digitized collection provides a wealth of information relating to the personal and professional lives of Welsh iron and steel workers. Many of the newspapers in this mill town, we're talking about like 120, 130 newspapers, both in English and Welsh. Many of them are located in mill towns in South Wales, and they become kind of like community information boards, publishing daily and weekly columns on the industry in Wales and in America. They cover America. Every issue has a column on America. They think of it, actually from their standpoint, they think that the industry is an extension of them industry here. That's why they feel very comfortable coming here, because they transplanted how things were done there. Here, they can just walk in and do the job. If they don't want to, they leave. They also published these newspapers also published an array of correspondence from workers who made the Atlantic passage and reported on Welsh immigrant families, communities, working conditions, travelers, sojourners, permanent transplants, family members often wrote open letters to their hometown newspapers back in Wales, confident that they would be read by family, friends, and co-workers hungry for news from the States. The constant flow of information regarding the conditions of life and employment in Wales also influenced the flow of immigration, or the outflow. Prosperity prompted Welsh iron workers to pack their bags, but news of work stoppages and economic slowdowns put travel plans on hold. A key advantage the Welsh held over other immigrant groups was that 75% of them had prior employment in the coal, iron, and steel industries, whereas only 15% of all immigrants, all immigrants as a total, only 15% of them had previous industrial experience of any kind. The 100,000 Welsh-born immigrants in the United States in 1890 were widely dispersed. This reflects the earlier migration of agricultural workers to the States. About half of the Welsh Americans, as late as 1900, after decades of Western migration, over half of the Welsh still lived in this area, in the coal and iron districts of the Upper Ohio Valley, which, I mean, if you're going by the Ohio Valley, I include the tributaries that lead into the Upper Ohio. And because 80% of the coal and iron of the country is produced in this region. So these were the kind of people they were, this is the kind of work they did, and this is where it was done, and so that's why they came. Prosperity prompted Welsh iron workers anyway to pack their bags, but you know the steel industry with coal and iron industry went up and down here too, just as it did back in Wales. And so when it was up there, they stayed home, and when it was down, they started looking abroad. So these 100,000 are scattered widely, but most of them are concentrated in this area. And again, why they would come here, I love this flow chart. This tells you so much, so I can stare at this thing for quite a while. But you can see where this is ore from the Mesabi Range coming into, and its origin to where it's delivered. And you can see where almost all of it's going. And it's in this particular region along Lake Erie, but when it comes into the ports of Lake Erie, it feeds down into all these steel towns. Immigration triggered social repercussions in Wales and America on a very personal level. And often we don't get down into the personal level. It's one of the things when I was younger, I wasn't that interested in immigration history as such, because they're prone to do numbers, and immigration is not about the numbers. What's the difference if it's 3 million or 4 million? It's the experience of it, the human beings who are involved, and they're workers. They are not privileged people. They don't leave records. Historians can't go around and rummage around in their records. You have to find other ways to connect with their experience, and that's much harder to do. So this what I'm talking about is this personal, a personal level. Now that's what I mean. What are the consequences of this? Families were the primary links in the networks that supported chain migration, which is mostly what we have in America. Transnational identities were forged among families in Wales and the US and created distinctive ethnic occupational communities. Whole communities were built were ethnic and occupational. For as long as memory and communications lasted, made America an extension of the coal and iron district of South Wales. And so let me just, again, this is the area we're talking about, is the British Isles. So it's not a large area. This is South Wales. And that's where the coal and iron district is located. And you'll notice that this coal and iron district is literally that. These are symbiotic, practically, industries. Without coal, there'd be no iron. Without iron, there wouldn't be any steel. Without any, and so on. So they're all in the same place. So we have this coal and iron district, and the coal fields generally are up at the heads of the valleys, the coal mines, and they're very large. and they send down to the port cities along here for export. There's an export coal industry in Wales, and there's one that's for the iron industry. So, because a lot of it is metallurgical coal. The coal mines are there, and you'll notice there's all the ironworks in South Wales. They tend to be, you see, they're up here. This is where we call the head of the valleys. The valleys, the rivers run south here into the to the ocean ports. And tin plate works are also here. This tin plate is an old industry. We don't hear much about it because it was used, had limited use until the 1880s, 90s to World War I. And in that period, you know, galvanized roofs were really part of this industry initially. But you also have, you know, like tin cans. There were tin cans before, but they weren't used widely because they soldered them from the inside, and you know, they would poison. You could get poison from using those cans. But they found a way to do that, and the industry boomed. And these tin plate mills were next to iron mills because they used iron sheets, and they would treat the iron sheets. It wasn't ideal, and eventually they used steel, of course, to replace iron, and that became the ideal sheet of metal that they then coated with a tin alloy and made into tin plate. Well, this becomes a huge industry in the 1890s, and the United States gets into a major trade war with little old Wales. It's called the Tin Plate War, actually. President McKinley passed the Tin Plate Act, which put a tariff on. We imported all our tin plate until 1890. In 1890, a tariff was passed on it that was so prohibitive that even Welsh employers or the operators moved to America. Some of the plants were moved here physically to operate in this country because it was the rising market, and they just couldn't afford to make it there and send it here. So this is why in the 1890s, and I'm going to be footloose with these dates a little bit because I've just referred to it all as like the iron and steel industry. This is just a segment of the steel industry, but it's not there in the earlier 19th century when they started, when the ironworks industry began in the U.S. The steel industry in the 70s and 80s, and then becomes dominant by the turn of the century. So this is a trend, but I can't really get it into this kind of a talk. Anyway, this is the location. It's surprisingly how dense. Almost all of Wales is rural, incidentally, and it's only that southern place, which is industrial for the most part. They even attracted immigrants themselves, actually, from England mostly, Scotland. Anyway, moving within these networks as family networks, the Welsh flocked to colonies of their countrymen in coal and iron towns, large and small, like Pittsburgh, Johnstown, Newcastle, Sharon, Youngstown, Wellsburg, Martins Ferry. I'm not mentioning Wheeling for a reason. Maybe we can come back to that later. The up close and personal nature of this ethnic and occupational clustering is illustrated by a story I found in a Welsh American newspaper of 1911, written by a man living in Youngstown at the time. I recently talked to a Mrs. William Davis, and after a short time I asked her where she hailed from. South Wales, she said. Well, what part? I inquired. Swansea, or Abertawe, as we Welsh call it. Oh, whereabouts in Abertawe? I inquired. Landor, a little place called Plasmar, actually near Landor. Oh, indeed. Which of the houses did you live in? I asked. Between Reese's and Edwards grocery stores. By that time, she found out I was familiar with the locality. We lived within a few yards of each other and left there within 12 months of each other for the States. The writer has a father, brother, sister, and a host of acquaintances scattered all over the United States, who will read this little story with a great deal of interest, and will be glad to learn that Mr. and Mrs. William Davis of Plasmar is still on earth and well and hearty. They desire to be remembered to their old acquaintances. The British have been called the invisible immigrants because prior to the Civil War, a large majority of white Americans were either of British birth or ancestry. The decades between the Civil War and World War I were the peak years of European immigration, and also was a period of aggressive racism and nativism. American-born white Anglo-Saxon Protestants felt threatened by the other, which included just about everybody who was not British or Northern European, including Asians, Africans, and the millions of recently arrived Southern and Eastern Europeans. The Welsh were regarded as ultra-Protestants. Their beef with England was that they were very Protestant, and in a Baptist form, like every chapel ruled its own flock. And they opposed the Church of England, which they regard as just a knockoff of the Catholic Church. These are, of course, issues that seem strange, but these are the things people kill for, in other times. So anyway, natives regarded them as effective counterweights to the Catholicism of the Southern and Eastern Europeans. Generally, Americans were either ignorant or unconcerned about the cultural and national distinctions found among the countries of the British Isles. While the English and Scots were simply absorbed into American society, the Welsh were more difficult to ignore. Yet Americans accepted them just as readily and for the same reasons. All British immigrants were received as welcome reinforcements to the native white stock. They didn't have to wait for generations to be accepted, nor, like the Asians and Africans, were they ever regarded as unassimilable. From the 18th century on, the Welsh had been attracted by the American political ideals which elevated democracy over aristocracy. And this is something we don't relate to because we're never a feudal country where you would be, because of your class, you inherited certain powers. But they were highly affected by it. So these political ideals were important to them. And one of Thomas Paine was a close friend of a guy called Richard Price, who we seldom pay attention to, who was a British intellectual who sided with Thomas Paine against the British government. And, well, you can imagine what his life was like. But it was this kind of commitment that was wholeheartedly embraced in Wales, even though, of course, they would have been heresy in England. Welsh Americans attempted to retain their identity, even though they, left their country, like most immigrants. They just, you can't reinvent yourself, and overnight. So you tend to bring with you the strategies of daily life that work for you. And that's all this really means. And they tended to bring uh, their culture with them. They attempted to retain their national identity in a sense. That's what these things would incorporate. But their national identity carried cultural markers that generally stigmatized other immigrant groups, such as an alien language. I don't know, you've probably never seen this alien language, but it is one of very long words full of consonants, which are almost impossible, seems almost impossible to us to speak. So where's the Welsh language? They speak a different language, like these other Europeans who are coming into the States. They get discriminated against because they don't speak English. Many of the Welsh are bilingual, but they have their own churches, Welsh language churches, clubs, societies, fraternal orders, all in the Welsh language. Music and poetry festivals like the Eisteddfod, which is what this is a Pittsburgh Eisteddfod. Incidentally, I have a terrible thing of getting sidetracked, but down here in the corner on the left is a guy called Bill Jones. He was Carnegie's superintendent of the Braddock Mill in Pittsburgh. He is a famous inventor, and so in his day, he was probably one of the most famous steelmen in the country, technical guys. And this, incidentally, that's the kind of the national garb for women. Now, if you wouldn't stick out for wearing this, I don't know what it would take. But and these are not little events. These people will come from states away to one of these musical. This is a uniquely Welsh festival that's done. That's like poetry and music, and on the stage up here on this elevated stage, you'll see someone playing a harp, and there's someone singing. But it's a singing and poetry. The word translates setting. Eisteddfod, but I don't know. It's just a gathering like this. It's a festival. Anyway, they also have their own Welsh language paper. There are over 1,000 ethnic papers in America in 1890 to 1920 because of so many different ethnic groups. And there are a lot of, well, I should call them periodicals. Some of them are magazine-like, and some of them are newspaper-like. This is more like a newspaper, and you can't read that, but it's that in there translates as, you can't translate it literally, but it means a national newspaper for the Welsh in the United States. That's what it translates. Idrik means mirror. So anyway, these paper, if you were in this period, I have mentioned aggressive, Anglo-Saxonism. These things are flags, like red flags, and where these papers will circulate, designate your neighborhood. If there are people who are hostile to you, they know where to find you. It gets complicated like that. Not unlike now, but then they could use the post office, and they knew where to look. Anyway, regardless of their cultural distinctiveness, what stood out about the Welsh to most Americans, and I include immigrants in that, is their dominance of the coal and iron industry. There are so few of them, and yet they're like a dominant minority who would appear to control the coal and iron industries. That's the impression, generalized impression of it. That's one thing. And then there's the clannishness. Everybody who refers to the Welsh refers to them as clannish. And the two ideas are related in this way. The Industrial Revolution occurred in Britain 75 to 100 years earlier than in the United States. And Wales and England provided expertise, of course, brought over to this country. First American investors returned, or first American investors retained Welsh managers. Welsh managers would then go around, were probably associated with a particular mill in Wales. They would then find their best workers and offer them to go to America to this new mill to start another one. And consequently, Welsh recruits generally migrated to American mills operated by one of their own. This is important because once that happens, you get like a pipeline of people coming and going back and forth. And because immigrants followed this family, ethnic, and occupational network, this pipeline was opened up from mill towns in Wales, colonies of their families and co-workers in America. During the artisanal phase of the industrial development, skilled workers were the linchpin in the process, especially the puddlers for the iron industry. Puddling then comes from the motion. The guy with his bar, this is not the thing he would puddle with, but you stick his long bar and you stir. It's like the puddling is the stirring motion in this pig iron. It's melted down, and in the process, it cooks off a lot of the impurities. It turns it from raw iron to wrought iron, and wrought iron is what they would use then to melt down and use for steel because it was better, the right kind of quality. Anyway, these puddlers and guys like them controlled the production process, as well as access to the craft and potential supervisory roles. In this way, they protected the special knowledge that came from long training and experience, typically passed on from father to son. This closed circle predictably stirred serious resentment among workers who were excluded. Steel executive Roy Rutherford, guy from Wheeling, recalled the Welsh tin platers shrouded their trade secrets in mystery, and for years the making of tin plate was considered something of a black art. Americans believed the Welsh used secret powders and complained that they only performed certain occupations behind closed doors so no one could see them. Rutherford observed that the Welsh looked upon operating the hot rolls as a real abracadabra. And this hot roll is simply in this technology just rolled back and forth. Someone would redouble, send it back, and it rolled it until it got to a certain thickness that was ordered by the customer, I suppose. But the roller knew that, and that's why he controlled the process of the rolling mill. He knew when that was. He didn't have to measure. He just knew what to do and when to stop, when it reached that prescribed thickness. Anyway, as late as 1927, a roll turner had grabbed his sledgehammer and chased a young engineer fresh from college. Scientific management is coming into its own. Chased a young engineer fresh from college who had the temerity to be snooping around with a micrometer, an instrument to measure the thickness. This is a threat to the roller because in it would take control of that skill away from him. And therefore he would have been just another guy working around the rolling mill. Rutherford affirmed that the Welsh did know their business and were the key men in the early American mills. Some of them developed into executives and capitalists. They dominated this field for a long period, and it was from them we secured the knowledge which we enlarged upon. Because of their clannishness, he said, they passed their craft down from father to son, usually did the best to make a Welsh monopoly of the industry. And Welsh clannishness, however, is probably less the explanation than just plain old simple craft protectionism, because craft unions have been doing that since the guild days. You protect the craft because you're protecting your livelihood. British iron workers who came to the U.S. brought a rich tradition of trade unionism with them based on the age-old principle of organization by craft, rather than industry-wide. The craft union was a mechanism for protecting the crafts from unskilled interlopers and uncooperative employers. Because they were concentrated in the skilled jobs, and because of their prior experience in unionism back in Britain. In 1872, Welshmen were instrumental in establishing the first national union of iron workers, called the Amalgamation Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Plate Workers. As late as 1909, half of the top leadership was still Welsh. That's the date of this part of the masthead of the amalgamated journal. One practice Welsh unionists did not transplant to America was the employment of women. And I find this an interesting part of the story because, well, people have just started really working on the role of women in work. Especially this was true in the employment of women in the sorting and boxing departments where they were concentrated back in Wales. We didn't have them in the United States. They didn't work in steel mills. In Wales, they did and had for a long time. Although this was a well-established practice in Wales, once they arrived in the States, Welsh tin platers steadfastly opposed women working in the mills the way they had accepted it in Wales. Let me just mention something about I use this term sorting department because I want to talk about some woman in Pittsburgh who was the first woman sorter, Welsh woman sorter, any sorter of any kind working in a steel mill. Sorting was the tail end of the tin plating process. The sheets have been cut into 20 by 14 sheets and have been gone through tinning, pickling, needling, all these processes, all of which required heat, and the plates would tend to stick together. So these women would use these knife-like instruments to break them open. These are very heavy, incidentally. Very heavy. These are, I think, here's the standard measurement for tin plate is a box. So one box is 112 sheets of tin plate, 20 by 14 sheets, put into one box. 20 of these boxes equals a ton. This is like, we say women can't do that because they're not strong enough. Well, I like this picture because, well, you can't, I don't think you can see it very well there. But the individuals in this photograph are very unique people, and it comes through very clearly. They also wear these gloves, and they wear aprons, canvas aprons. Because these things are sharp, they get cuts on them all the time while they're handling them. They also came through acid baths and all that. So this is not fun work. Boxing, on the other hand, is they would take these are the women in the boxing department who would take these tin plates and pack them in boxes. And they also, wore aprons and gloves and so on because they could get cut. Okay, this practice wasn't transported to the United States. Now I want to give you something of the reason for it. The outcry from American, Welsh, and mill workers when a Pittsburgh tin plate company hired Hetty Williams in 1895 reveals the class and gender fault lines that fragmented the transnational work culture created by these Welsh tin platers. Hetty was reportedly the first woman to gain employment in an American tin plate mill, and with 10 years of experience as a sorter or opener of tin plates in Wales, she was given the task of training half a dozen women to perform this task with this very heavy work. Some of the male outrage over Hetty's employment was anchored in the structural changes that occurred during the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution in Britain radically reorganized and mechanized industries, such as mining and metal production. One of the major outcomes was the displacement of women from jobs in heavy industry. However, the tin plate manufacturers were not affected by this transformation immediately. They continued to rely on the old skilled artisans rather than machinery until well after World War I. Women had been part of the tin plate workforce from early times, and incidentally, it's close to maybe 1,000 years old, tin plating. And the social relations of production, who worked there, doing what, and so on, had remained unchanged for at least 200 years in Wales. Welsh American metal workers earned 2 or 3 times what they had earned in Wales, enabling many to realize their dream of rising into the middle class. They could therefore insist that women stay at home. One of the key distinctions between a working class woman and a middle class or family. And so this is a key distinction. This is particularly in Victorian times. With the elevation to middle class status came the social anxieties generated by the Victorian concern for respectability. You cannot read anything in this period without running across the word respectability. It's uniquely Victorian, particularly regarding gender roles. Like other class-conscious Victorians, Welsh immigrants fretted over the deterioration of moral standards presented by today's women, who neglect and despise the office that belonged to them, especially that of keeping house, one commentator wrote. The Welsh American press dogmatically followed that line. A Pittsburgh Gazette interview with Hetty Williams about her new job brought a storm of protest from Welsh and American millmen alike. One respondent declared that the employment of women in the metal industries has always been one of the deepest disgraces of British industrial policy, and America cannot afford the moral and social degeneracy which accompanies the degradation of women. Another Welsh contributor found his sense of respectability assaulted when he witnessed girls wearing the coarse canvas aprons, which is why I wanted to mention those, aprons and leather gloves of the sorters while toiling in a stifling heat under the same roof and in the midst of 200 or 300 men in an atmosphere that was reeking with smoke, gas, profanity, and none of the privacy that is so essential for the delicacy of womanhood. Still another exercise Welshman submitted one of his many jeremiads in the Welsh language. His article, "A Shame on Our Nation," meaning Wales, condemned Hetty for introducing old customs from the land of our fathers that did not reflect honor on our nation. Poverty justified the practice in Wales. Conditions in America did not. Moreover, other women would follow Hetty's example, and the inevitable result would be lower wages for the male workforce. Although job protection was the most obvious motive behind male opposition to the employment of women, their displeasure was overtly expressed in sexist terms. Both Welsh and American workers defined Hetty's heresy as a gender issue, not a class issue. By the working class issue, By the 1890s, it had already become conventional in Britain to think of these gender divisions as an old tradition, when in fact they represented a new tradition that evolved out of the Victorian ethos of female domesticity and two powerful and interrelated working class ideals, which was a male breadwinner and the family wage or living wage. Industrial capitalism, which concentrated capital and production into ever larger, vertically integrated plants, dissolved the old household and cottage industry or economy in which women had played a central role as producers. By the time Hetty entered the Pittsburgh mill in 1895, the definition of a producer had morphed into one of a man who left the home and family unit to ideally, anyway, make a family wage, a living wage. This ideology legitimized the division of labor along gender lines by recasting female labor as just supplemental, rather than central to the family economy as it had been previously, and further justified unequal wage rates and gender segregation in the labor market. British immigrants were instrumental in transfusing these ideas into the American labor movement, and the Welsh in particular were responsible for transplanting them into the operating ideologies of the iron and coal unions. By 1925, when John L. Lewis published The Fight for American Standards, by then it had become not the family wage, but the American standards. This is a development for 50 years by then. And that's what it came to be called instead of the family wage. These guiding principles, anyway, had become sacrosanct to organized labor, especially in the heavy industries. And you could, I'll leave that for later. Welsh tin platers may have transplanted their gender hopes and dreams to America, but Hetty simply ignored them. And well, you'd be surprised, the storm of protest. I mean, the papers are full of it. I mean, even the New York Times picked up this story. So it's bigger than what it is. You know, it's symbolic of something bigger. Anyway, Hetty just ignored all that. And despite the uproar, she remained on the job until her husband was well enough to get back to work. For her, it was that simple. And women found no lasting foothold in the American tin plate or any other metalworking industry either. The few women who did follow Hetty into the mill were soon replaced by mechanization, and their fate more or less forecast what was going to happen to these skilled men who were so disturbed by the loss of respectability. In less than a decade, they also would be displaced. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, steel production displaced iron, shifted to technologies which eliminated many of the highly skilled iron artisans. By 1903, the United States Steel Corporation had consolidated some 45 steel companies, large in and of themselves, and gained a monopoly over nearly all sectors of the industry. In short order, U.S. Steel mechanized all of their plants, got rid of the ones they couldn't work profitable, and in 1910 crushed the Amalgamated Association in a final showdown. The modern integrated steel mill, massive smoky behemoths we all know and love, or at least remember. What was the outcome of that? Just as a side note, if I can quickly stick this in there, the notion of an integrated iron mill, steel mill, was developed in Wales, and it was the model was 2 steel mills in Wales, which were the leading mills in the world in the early 19th century. They integrated. They took the iron ore and other ores, including coal, brought them in, produced the stuff. They had the transportation and took it to market. They didn't distribute it, but they took it to market. So from beginning to sending it out the door, it was all done in one continuous process. This is, of course, you can read. I don't know if you can read that. That's the Edgar Thomson Mill at the turn of the 20th century, up at the top in Pittsburgh. The second one is the Homestead Mill, and the Duquesne Steel down on the third picture. I just showed that because this is the time when you couldn't see across the river for snow. Incidentally, that ain't so long ago. Well, maybe it is. I'm getting as old as dirt, but I can remember not seeing across the river in Homestead, and literally you couldn't see across the river. And there were times when even I grew up around Steubenville, but in Wheeling and in Steubenville, there were times you'd say, "Well, a good time," when you could smell that smell. And it was everywhere. Everybody was working. If the air was clear, you could see across the river. Tough times, man. Nobody's working. Anyway, these are the kinds of things, these are the rhythms of the industry that I'm talking about. They affect people directly, but yeah, nobody writes about that. You always want to, when you're dealing with the economy and industry, everybody wants to write about numbers, which actually I'm not opposed to. It tells you a lot, but it doesn't tell you, anything about what life was like. Anyway, with the demise of the Amalgamated Association and the displacement of skilled workers by technology, mechanical innovations, and scientific management, the steel industry in the United States was no longer a magnet for Welsh immigrants, or really any other immigrants. Meanwhile, the recovery of the tinplate industry back in Wales once again offered Welsh workers secure employment at home. Their migration and there had been driven by a push by unemployment back in the old country and the pull of possibilities of employment and a better life in America. With these forces neutralized, there was little reason for Welsh workers to pull up stakes and start anew in America. Therefore, awareness of the Welsh immigrants, however little they are, small they were, not to mention the critical role they played in establishing America's basic industry, and I think it's worth saying again, the role of basic industry in creating America as a global industrial power, which shaped the whole American 20th century world, really, soon faded anyway from our collective memory, and we no longer think about that. So anyway, since nobody cares or thinks about it anymore, that's a room for historians. So that's me. That's why I'm doing it. Okay, that concludes things. I just want to mention a couple things on the side by way of comment. I forgot to show you Youngstown. These mills, incidentally, the rolling mill uh, at Homestead was a mile long. I mean, this is the scale we're talking about. You're talking about a massive scale. Mile. You go run down the river at Pittsburgh for at least 12 miles and never be away from a steel mill. This one you'll recognize as LaBelle, and you'll wonder why I haven't mentioned Wheeling. So I have to come back to that just briefly. Initially, I thought Wheeling would play a central role. I'd be one of my key anchors, in this coal and steel complex of Upper Ohio. And it is one of the anchors, but there aren't any Welsh or any to speak of. A significant number of Welsh come to Wheeling during this period. And the reason is simple. Wheeling, the Welsh didn't go to iron towns just because they were iron towns. They went there because their people were there. That's the nature of chain migration. Their people weren't in Wheeling. Wheeling was a prominent iron town very early in the 19th century, in the 1800s. This is when they were the nail capital of the world, probably, at least the United States. And so they had a lot of ironworks. When an ironworks was produced, they had the iron workers already here. Well, if you're working for a job and looking to get in on a ground level and be secure in your job, you're not going to come to Wheeling. They already got a lot of iron workers there, and your skill is not in demand. And so they don't. And secondly, when the next big wave past iron, when it comes to like the tin plate workers come from Wales. Tin plate workers were almost exclusively Welsh who came to this country. They didn't come to Wheeling because 1890s was not just a time of the tin plate, but it was a time when it was shifted from cut nails to steel or wire nails. And you could re-outfit an iron mill or an iron nail mill over into a tin plate mill. Apparently, I can't tell you how that's true. That's just what I read. More complicated than I understand. But apparently the machinery was adaptable to that, and the skills of iron worked well in tin plate. In fact, in Wales, iron and tin plate were often established right next to each other because they were viewed as working together. So anyway, that's why I haven't included Wheeling in this, because I'm basically following an ethnic group rather than the industry. It's where they go that as what interests I have to be checked out on. So anyway, let me stop there. I know you get tired of my droning voice. So. If I can or can't answer any questions, I'd be happy to do it though, or comments.
One quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
When you think of the state of famine as a reason for the huge influx, any particular event that happened in Wales that some of this?
Well, the migration from Wales are triggered by the economy, and for technical reasons, the economies in Wales and a lot of England worked in counterbalance of the U.S. economy because of the kinds of products in a world market. So when U.S. was booming, jobs were down in the UK. When jobs boomed there, people stayed home, and it meant because there was no jobs over here. And so if you look at employment in the industries, it's like this.
So no particular catastrophic.
There are, but they are, like the enclosure movement came to Wales the same as it did in Ireland. and Scotland. And that's also instrumental. What it does it's a little different in Wales because what the enclosure movement did in Wales was it was preeminently a rural agricultural country, small scale. It pushed those people off their holdings and into the new iron and coal valleys. And so now they're locked into iron and coal. And so whatever happens there, and some of this enclosure stuff is related to the corn laws, and it gets this is so wrapped up in British history that it comes from the wars in Europe and the loss of land in corn, which is the grain that feeds most people who are in the cities and people moving off. So there are these big swings like that, but nothing like as dramatic as what happens in Ireland. And many people, of course, would think that the explanation for what happened in Ireland is pure and simple. The British just did that to them. Not the British generally, but the Tories who were in power enforced that they should send the corn, even though they had a down year and the crops went kaput. They couldn't even rely on the potatoes. So it's that's the big dramatic event. So they can even call it the potato famine. But there's nothing like that in the Welsh migration.
Recent 20 years, I think there's 12,000